The Analogue N64 FPGA just released, and it is not at all what their marketing claims. Within my first hour of using it, I found several issues that entirely refute almost every single claim about this product that they have made, and I am going to prove all of that. Despite that, I am hopeful for its future, because I have insider info, because I have talked to the engineer that worked on the Analogue. Before anyone brands me a hater for shitting all over their marketing, I want to say that I love that companies are going out and making FPGAs, and this is a fantastic FPGA. But it being a fantastic FPGA makes it all the weirder that their entire marketing strategy amounted to blatantly lying about what their product does. First, what is an FPGA and why is it different from an emulator like they say in the marketing? Well, an FPGA is an emulator, but unlike the usual method of emulating in software, it is handled in hardware. This makes them more expensive to develop and makes iterations slower, but everything being implemented in hardware means you can emulate complex behaviors and electrical circuits that would run in parallel without slowdown. Saying that a hardware emulator is not an emulator is kinda like saying an electric car isn't a car and then selling it as a teleporter or something. And just like a software emulator, hardware emulators can have issues in terms of accuracy or even physical compatibility, which is their next claim. Apparently it can directly interface with the original cartridges and accessories because it recreates the console at the electrical and timing level. Okay, then why does my EverDrive not boot on it? I'll be fair and let you know that it does work with my summer card, but there is clearly an inaccuracy here somewhere. Of course, it is very cool that most accessories do work, so don't get me wrong, I think this is awesome. But since we have already found one accessory that would not work, what else would break? I wonder, for example, if something like James Lambert's funny VR or skateboard gadgets would work. Since we already know the recreation is not perfect, there is no way for us to know for sure that those would work. And let's check the other claim, being cycle accurate. One somewhat famous example of lag being a major factor in how a game functions is the intro of Donkey Kong 64. On RS, an extremely accurate Nintendo 64 emulator, for a long time we would see Donkey Kong miss this vine here during the intro on the PAL version only. The Analogue 3D manages to play the scene back just fine. That is actually amazing. And it even managed to play back some more high-tech demos, like the Small 64 ROM, which is an entire 3-minute animation that is stored entirely in only 4 kilobytes. 4 kilobytes, that's about as big as one 32x64 texture. But while it does have those two things going for it, when we actually put a game on here and performance profile it, we see some huge inaccuracies. In my game, Return to Yoshi's Island, I have a built-in profiler that measures the time each process takes in microseconds. This footage here is on a real Nintendo 64. You can see that the RDP process, which is the triangle drawing process, takes the longest. If you divide 1000 microseconds by this number, you pretty much get the frames per second. And when I run the same performance test on the Analogue, I see that the CPU is about 6% slower than on a normal Nintendo 64. And the RSP, the triangle computing process, is even a whole 30% slower than on a normal N64. It is so much slower that now the RSP has become the bottleneck and reduced our frame rate by 15%. If a game was RSP bottlenecked, it would mean, for example, a 60 FPS game will now run at 46 frames per second. That's an insane difference. This thing is nowhere near cycle accurate. Even the RS emulator was closer than the Analogue in terms of RSP timing, and it does not even emulate the RDP timings. Honestly, this is more like an HDMI modded N64 board of Temu. Which brings me to this video sponsor, Temu. Temu is literally giving $20 to all new users with no requirements other than signing up for the app. If you spend just $20 and a single cent, you can use the full $20 coupon. Just download the Temu app from the App Store and enter my code KCP2589 to access the event page and then pick the $20 coupon. The $20 coupon also works for existing users, but I have no idea how. They have new Switch games, or even the 8BitDo controller, a brand officially partnered with Analogue and compatible with the Analogue 3D. They have tons of Nintendo games as well, retailing around the same or sometimes even cheaper prices as you would see on Amazon. Look at Legend ZA on Temu, 67 Canadian. These are Canadian dollars, not real US dollars. And on Amazon, 84. It actually works. They ship locally from the US, so you don't have to worry about the import charges either. The discount code works for everything, even Nintendo games and controllers. Temu has a bunch of other promotions available as well periodically, so it is often the cheapest way to buy things. The Analogue's unleashed overclock option is closer to the Nintendo 64's performance on the RSP than the so-called hardware accurate mode. Okay, but how could this happen? Donkey Kong 64 was running at just the right performance. How could it suddenly be so inaccurate? Well, let's take a look at a third game. Fasana's optimized Diddy Kong Racing. Here we see the FPS at worst being about 4% lower than on a Nintendo 64, which has led me to the following belief. I thought that what was actually going on is that they handle it similar to how software emulators do it, which is to simply add up timings of individual hardware components to guess how much performance was used, and then, instead of emulating conflicts between these components, software emulators often simply multiply the time each component took by some factor to simulate how much resource conflicts between these components would slow each component down. That's obviously much easier to do than to actually emulate the hardware accurately, and in an average use case it will work out well enough. But if you have an outlier game like mine that avoids a lot of stuff that would cause hardware components to slow each other down and gets more work done overall, it would lead to these huge inaccuracies. I've had similar behavior happen on Project 64 before, where my game would usually run 60 FPS, higher than real hardware, but before I fixed my loading screens, the loading screens would take more than twice as long on emulators. Now that's just my perspective. Fortunately, I have actually talked to the person working on the core, and I want to make clear that this is not the same person that did the marketing, and I know they were making FPGAs out of passion before this, so I trust their word a bit, and they assured me that they don't just have inaccurate timings with a multiplier slapped onto it. So they might actually be doing the really hard work of emulating hardware component conflicts, and there's just something else unique about my game that's causing these inaccuracies. Slightly related to being cycle accurate, with the Summer card we can upload some test ROMs and test some more behavior. For example, here's the N64 system test ROM written by the homebrew community to check if all the basic Nintendo 64 behavior is implemented. On Ares, the current most accurate software emulator, it only fails 1 out of 3662 tests from the basic ones and 4 of the cycles or timing ones. Pretty nice. So how many does the Analogue fail? As it turns out, 2 of the basic ones, but none of the cycle ones. This does mean that in some ways it is less accurate than our software emulators, and in others it is more accurate. There are actually a lot of behaviors that you won't see in retail games that are not emulated by the Analogue 3D. Features too advanced for the developers back then to use. For example, we can actually get an entire extra megabyte of memory, 12.5% more bits per byte on the Nintendo 64 using advanced technology. This is Hail to the Longest test ROM, which comes with some tests for rare behaviors. This test right here checks whether the hidden 9th megabyte is visible to the CPU. It works on the Nintendo 64, but not on the Analogue. That is kind of a tragedy. As a result, the test is unable to render Yoshi the legally distinct dinosaur. Similar, the repeat mode, a mode that lets you write many of the same bytes at once, useful to zero out regions, a gift the Nintendo 64 hardware designer gave us but no retail game ever used, is also not emulated. Of course, if your only goal is to get the machine that plays your old cartridge, this won't matter at all. But if you want a cycle accurate hardware without emulation that acts like the N64, the product you were advertised, prepare for heartbreak. And there's something much more sinister to these inaccuracies. I happen to know that Nintendo 64 games are still produced to this day. And if Analogue does not implement all missing features before its lifetime is over, and these new games use new features to run better on the Nintendo 64 or the newly announced M64 by Mod Retro, the Analogue is not going to be able to play those. We have insane new technology like Hail to the Longest 256 by 256 texture demo, HDR, ray marching, and so much more. And who knows, maybe the next technique we find you will not be able to use on the Analogue. What's worse is that developers may be discouraged from properly investigating into the Nintendo 64 hardware because they want their games in the future to be analog 3D compatible. Something similar held back the Mario 64 modding scene for years because we wanted emulator compatibility, and I don't want a repeat of that situation. Another claim I want to talk about real quick is the zero lag claim. And sure, I believe them that if you run an accurate software emulator and compare to this emulator, it will have more lag. But there is no way you can say that software emulation always has more lag. On most software emulators, you can opt into displaying frame buffers instantly after they're calculated, which gives you 1 or in most games even 2 frames less input lag. This doesn't work for every game, but for a game like Mario 64 you can easily just do that. This feature is not implemented on the analog, which means that a lot of games can have less input lag than they do on the analog 3D, which makes this a really weird thing to highlight. Okay, but aside from the marketing lies, or more charitable inaccuracies, is this a good product to play Nintendo 64 games on? I would say it is a very cool and very practical gadget. The console is a fair bit smaller than a normal N64, and in fact the place I am storing my analog in wouldn't work for an N64, and I imagine being able to use modern USB controllers and HDMI is a huge quality of life upgrade for most gamers. Honestly, my only real gripe with playing on the analog is that I have to configure the CRT filter for each game individually, and that it takes almost 20 seconds to boot into the OS. Oh my god, waiting for the OS to finish booting is infuriating. This is Microsoft levels of slow. But it is the most accurate emulator you can use right now. And it will continue to get more accurate, as I've talked to the engineer on this project and he aims to improve the accuracy in future updates. It is factually your second cheapest option to be able to play Nintendo 64 games, mostly without tech issues. The only cheaper option is to get an N64 and an HDMI mod if you need to hook it up to a modern TV. Plus, the analog has overclock options, so you can get most games working fine at much better frame rates than on an original N64, including my mod Return to Yoshi's Island. It actually runs almost perfect consistent 60 FPS. And that's it for the review. Shoutouts to all my patrons. I've mentioned it throughout the video, but I am working on this mod here that runs on real N64. It uses some insane Nintendo 64 technology to get the most performance out of the console. If you would like to follow its development, make sure to follow my channel. I finished all 15 main courses and I'm currently working on making the overworld. You can view development of the game live with at least 3 updates a week on my second channel.